Kate, it's wonderful to see you virtually.
Always.
And it's been fun to share some time with you on the campaign to create the Julius Rosenwald National Historic Site. And because I don't know, I just thought I'd start by asking you, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Rochester, New York, way upstate New York, where it's cloudy all winter and cold. Sort of like now
And
here.
there's lots of snow. Yeah.
Lots of snow.
Did you have early experiences that pointed you towards the kind of work you're doing now? That experiences with national parks or with
It's
the
not
outdoors?
really. I went to college for art, fine arts. And it turned out that I was really lousy at fine arts. And they made you take art history courses along with fine arts. And so I took a couple, and my advisor said, I think you might have the wrong idea. I think you'd be better as an art historian than you would be as an artist. So I took her advice, and all of a sudden my grades went up, my interest went up because I was doing art history. And when I graduated from graduate school, I worked at the Smithsonian for a year. And I worked with people who had done a lot of fine arts and decorative arts, and also a lot of people who were interested in historic preservation. And when I left the Smithsonian, I came to the Park Service directly. And so I only worked at the Smithsonian a little more than a year. And then after that, my career was all at the National Park Service. And I came immediately into the National Register of Historic Places. That was my first job in the Park Service. So that is entirely historic preservation related.
And what did that work consist of with the National Register?
With the Register?
Yeah.
We were reviewing, in 1966, with the Historic Preservation Act, the secretary could ask each of the states to nominate a state historic preservation officer and to establish a state review board. And it was the responsibility of the state to identify historic properties throughout their states and to nominate them to the National Register. And so we would get all the nominations from the states and review them and ask questions if they hadn't provided some piece of information, or if so. Carol Shull, who's also on the board, and I started together reviewing National Register nominations. So we got to see information about historic properties all across the United States. It was a great education and a great opportunity to talk with people who were really interested in local preservation and interested in saving their historic places.
Did you get to travel to visit a lot of them? Was that part of the job?
Yes, we did. I've been to all 50 states as part of my job in the Park Service from one way or another, and saw a lot of wonderful historic buildings, both owned by the Park Service and those privately owned.
And you must have been part of the process that created the cultural resource parks as an addition to, we think of the national parks, we think of the Grand Canyon, we think of natural sites, but the cultural resources, it was kind of a newer direction.
Actually, not quite. And it's interesting because 2/3% of the parks are cultural parks. So it's really the predominant number of parks are cultural. And it started really at the very beginning of designating historic sites, as well as, in fact, the first parks were historic sites. And then later, well, Yellowstone was the first national park, but these various designations protected parks, and the Antiquities Act was meant to protect the very earliest, the Indian remains and some of those things as well. So really, my involvement with historic properties and historic sites, cultural sites, really started from the very beginning, although I only became responsible for guiding, when they would take it, historic properties, cultural resources in national parks, when I moved to Denver.
So you moved to Denver as part of your work?
I started in Washington, and then I transferred to Denver as part of what was then the Rocky Mountain region, and we had 16 states and like 26 national parks to work with. And wow. after Denver, we moved to Philadelphia in what was then the Northeast region. And we're responsible for about as many states and parks up there, because we dealt with both the national parks and the state historic preservation offices. So we had sort of a dual responsibility, but it also made it twice as interesting.
Yeah. Sounds
National Historic
wonderful.
Landmarks and national parks. Yeah, it was a great job. Great job.
I know this is unfair to ask. It's like asking a mother who her favorite child is, but do you have a park or any parks that are especially dear to your heart?
I particularly like Glacier National Park. I think it's the prettiest one I've been to. In terms of cultural parks, that is more like my babies. I don't think I could tell you which one I like better than another. They're all really, really interesting. Even the ones that some people hate.
Before we talk about the Rosenwald Park campaign, which I know is dear to your heart, I just want to ask you, what led you to write a book about Sears mail order homes?
Well, that began with the National Register again. We got nominations for a couple of mail order homes, and I had never heard of that before. And so I got really, really interested. And I went to Chicago and went through the Sears archives at that time and saw all the wonderful photographs they had. And the National Trust called me and said, would you be interested in writing a book about this? And my colleague Ward Jandal and I collaborated on trying to find the Sears houses. And we got lots of wonderful letters and people saying, oh, I have a Sears house, or can you come tell me about Sears houses? And for those who don't know, Sears and Company from 1909 to 1929 had houses that you could order by mail. And you would write them and say, I like design number X, and they would ship it to the nearest railhead. So if you were a developer, you could do them on spec, or if you were a homeowner, and we heard from lots of people whose grandparents had built a house from Sears or whatever. And in terms of Rosenwald, what really interested me in that was that during the Depression, Mr. Rosenwald didn't foreclose on any of the mortgages that he had for those houses, for his employees or for many of the homeowners that had bought Sears houses with mortgages. And that was very impressive. It was a really good, the other thing about Sears is that he hired a woman decorator or architect who was, if you wanted to order all of the furnishings for your house, you could order them and she would send them to you, and she'd pick them out and mail them all to you.
Oh my gosh, that's just a
everything, soup to nuts.
Wonderful story. Do you have any sense of how many Sears homes were there? How many of these homes?
I can't remember now. A lot. I mean, a
lot.
whole lot, because they had places to construct them, or mills in New Jersey and in Illinois and other places as well. So there were a lot of them, a lot. And a lot still remain. If you go to Tacoma Park, DC, you'll see a lot of them. Also in Virginia and Arlington have a lot of Sears houses. So it was a fun thing to do.
Yeah, it must have been exciting. So that actually does connect us to the Rosenwald Park campaign.
Exactly.
Tell me about your involvement with that.
Well, it was Dorothy Cantor, obviously, who looped me into the campaign, into the Rosenwald Park. She and I had been collaborating on something that didn't work out, an art project with the National Park Service. And I had mentioned I had worked on the book for Houses by Mail in Rosenwald. And she had then seen the Aviva Kempner movie. And she said, well, would you be interested in working on this as well? And I said, absolutely, be fascinating. So then I met all of you and got really interested and involved.
It's a fascinating story, and there's so much to it.
There's so much to it, exactly.
It touches on so many different things.
Including things like the houses, which who would have known that Mr. Rosenwald was so broad in his interests, well, sales interests, of course, but also in his philanthropy. I didn't know, not until you told me.
Yeah.
And I read your book.
Yeah. What do you think about the possibility of forming a network of some kind to connect all the schools to each other?
I think that's a wonderful idea. I think it's a way to continue both the collaboration and also I think the preservation of the schools, because when we have enough interest in them and when people are able to talk to other people who are working on them as a project, I think interest grows, but I also think the support for the schools will grow. So I think that's a very important step that we need to be taking. The National Trust started it, of course, with
Right.
their campaign and their endangered properties. But I think we can continue their work and engage them and engage others in preserving these schools.
And of course, the amazing thing that I keep coming back to is just how many of these schools there were. And even with a lot of them having now been lost, having disintegrated or being torn down, there are still so many of them. That was so many communities were touched by that Rosenwald philanthropy.
And are still touched.
Yeah.
I mean, you go to the schools and you meet the people who are preserving them, and they are, at least I universally, I don't know, I haven't been to all the schools you have practically, but they're so nice, they're so devoted, they're so proud of the schools and what they did for their community. And they had, as Bob Stanton calls it, a thirst for knowledge. And the communities really rose up and prepared the schools and donated to the schools. The kids went to the schools. It was a community in and of itself.
It really was that combination of, as you say, the thirst for knowledge, the thirst for education, but the incredibly supportive experience of having the community create the school and donate to the school and maintain the school. And it just left such a positive feeling with.
Absolutely. They had the teachers live in their houses sometimes. Their fathers and brothers drove the buses to get kids to school. I mean, it was really an involvement of the community in a very positive way. So,
I was visiting a man in Texas who had gone to a Rosenwald school, and we were in the house he'd grown up in, which wasn't very big. And he said, "Oh, the teacher lived with us during the week. She'd go home on the weekend, but during the week she'd live with us." And that was a common thing. And that was part of what contributed to that incredibly warm community feeling, was that the teachers were part of the community. And I've heard of so many cases where a single teacher stayed for decades in the same school and educated sisters and brothers and cousins. And
the teachers themselves were well educated, because Rosenwald made sure that the teachers that were hired were very capable in teaching the lessons that needed to be taught. So it was really, I mean, it's a great story, and should be preserved, and the information about it should be spread out in terms of more people should know about it, and a national park is a good way to do that.
And the idea of a discontiguous national park, I guess, is one that's becoming a little more common, or?
Yeah, there are a few that are sort of groundbreakers, but none quite as unusual as this. But I think because of the nature of the separation of the schools and the importance that a system of schools is, that I think it really works best if we have at least a handful of schools that people can visit, can understand what it was like to be in one of those schools and to see the community around them. And then to hear that there were other schools and other communities that had the same positive reaction, I think is a very important thing.
And the variety of the settings in which the schools occur.
Yes.
One of the things I've been struck by as I've visited schools is, my gosh, if this is this rural in 2010, what was it like in 1915 or 1920 when the school was built?
Yeah.
And I'm sure, like me, you've talked to many people who said, "Oh, we walked 2 miles, we walked 3 miles to school."
Exactly.
And
then on the other, I'm sorry. And then on the other hand, some of the schools were built in the city.
Yes, there were some built in the city. Dunbar in Little Rock, and there's one in Winston-Salem that's still a school, one of the brick ones. that is still a part of the public school system. So yeah, there were the brick ones, and there were that wonderful 2-room schoolhouse that's so typical.
Yes, those are really special. And the light in the windows is absolutely amazing. They were all built so that the light came in over the shoulders of the children so that they could read all day long or see their work. And it was very special light, very good.
And when you go to the schools now, so many of those huge windows look out on fields or woods, or they're still in places that are very rural. And
the atmosphere is still there.
Kate, where do things stand now with the creation of the park?
Well, legislation passed to direct the National Park Service to do a special resource study. And a special resource study is required in law for a National Park Service to make a recommendation about whether an area or a property should be a national park. And what they do is they do inventories. And of course, we've already done that for them. So I don't think they'll be doing a whole lot more of that. But they'll also do what are called suitability and feasibility studies, which is, would this property, would this site, would this collection of sites be suitable to be a national park? That is there parking? Is it in the middle of a neighborhood where people really don't want visitors? Is it, those kinds of questions. And feasibility, can we do it? Is it in a situation where it's so deteriorated that we really can't bring it back? Would we be able to get handicapped visitors in it? Those kinds of questions have to be answered. So the National Park Service, that just passed at the end of 2020. So the National Park Service now has that on their plate to do. And the next steps are that we have to meet with the National Park Service, see what priority that study has, help them if we can, help them if they're interested in it. But it will be their decision about which schools, if any, are included in the national park and when that recommendation will come out. So we're sort of hoping to encourage them to put this at a high priority in their work. But of course, they have a lot of other priorities, but we're really hopeful that they can put this toward the top.
What's your sense of how long this process could take?
Well, it can take 5 years. So that's why we're really anxious it can take upwards of 5 years, but we're really anxious to get the National Park Service to consider the work we've already done. I mean, the context study that we've done, the inventories we've done, the reaching out to the state historic preservation officers and so on, should give them a really good leg up. So we're really hopeful that they'll take this to heart and they'll realize the importance and the interest in this park and get going on it.
Why do you think this park is particularly important right now?
Well, I think that, as everybody knows, the country is vastly divided. And seeing the importance and the generosity of an individual and the difference it made in the lives of other people, disadvantaged people, people who didn't have an ability to go to school, and the effect that it had on those people, both at the time and then even as it stretches forward, I think is a very important lesson, and one that's very interesting, should be very interesting to people. And I hope that we can have this come to fruition so that more people can learn about this idea properly.
It's a very powerful story about community, as much
Very
as it
much
is about
so.
generosity from the Julius Rosenwald end. It's also about the extraordinary generosity of the people in the communities.
And the as Bob calls it, the thirst for knowledge.
Yes.
And what that resulted in. And it was substantial and important. And as I said, continues to this day.
One point that Dorothy Cantor has made repeatedly is that there is no National Park Service site dedicated to the life and contribution of a Jewish American, which I think surprised many of us when we first heard it. And of course, that is part of Julius Rosenwald's story, his Jewish identity. How do you see that as being part of what the national park, what the story that the national park will tell?
I think that's an important part. And, you know, right now, the only site that even has minimal connections with Judaism is the Truro Synagogue, and that's only a part of the national park system as an architectural site. And I think it's important that we recognize religions and their contributions to American history, and people who were of religions, as Julius Rosenwald was, an important Jew who uh, made significant contributions to African Americans during the Jim Crow era, because he was so moved by the comparison between the pogroms in Europe and what had been done to, and was continuing to be done to, African Americans in the United States.
I think it's fascinating that there was a race riot in 1908 in Springfield, Illinois, his hometown.
Yeah,
And he wasn't there then, but that surely caught his attention.
I would
And
think.
that was just about the time that he was becoming interested in this and reading up from slavery and starting to think about race relations. And I think it really caught his attention that here he was raising money to send to victims of pogroms in Europe, and a similar kind of violence was happening against Black people in this country.
In his
And
hometown.
in his hometown. And the anti-Semitism that his parents had fled was kind of finding an echo here.
Well, I'm sure that he probably existed. I mean, he probably suffered from anti-Semitism here in the United States.
Well, Kate, it's been fun talking to you, and I look forward to the day that you and I walk through the visitor center in Chicago and then tour schools maybe in several southern states and get to talk some more about this story that we both find so inspiring.
I would love that. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for this time together.